Okay, at first sight, it may seem obvious that the experience of disorientation would be highly disruptive to an inquiry and may very well lead to the abandonment of cognitive projects. However, there is a growing accumulation of research now emerging which suggests that the experience of disorientation or bewilderment is somehow central to at least certain cognitive inquiries. Mulhall gives the example of Heidegger's Being and Time, where a sense of disorientation is elicited and intentionally maintained throughout the book. Mulhall claims this is necessary in order to acknowledge that Dasein displays itself as a limited whole only against an ungraspable background. He also gives the example of Wittgenstein, who famously claimed a philosophical problem has the form "I don't know my way about," which again seems to suggest that disorientation has an intimate relation to the ability to proceed with a philosophical inquiry. Amy Harbin argues in a related vein that certain events such as illness, trauma, racism, and experiences of queerness can cause in us the emotion of disorientation, and this emotion can have beneficial moral effects of tenderizing us to the vulnerabilities of ourselves and others. Finally, there is evidence in the psychological literature of a common process of post-traumatic growth that can occur after a devastating life crisis involving disorientation and can lead to an enhanced appreciation of life, suggesting that disorientation can be existentially beneficial. All these examples highlight that disorientation can be pivotal in our sense-making relation to the world. It therefore seems appropriate to examine the relation of disorientation to cognition in more detail to see if this once neglected emotion can be a positive value in our inquiries. In this paper, I will argue that the experience of the emotion of disorientation should be a background to any intellectual inquiry and play the role of an indicator of when the project threatens to traverse the boundaries of sense. I will firstly elaborate how disorientation can be understood as an emotion and the type of emotion it is, namely what aspect of the world it makes salient. I will argue that it is an emotion that is evoked through the encounter with what we might want to call mystery. I will then expand on my claim that disorientation has a role in cognitive inquiry and as an indicator of where the boundary of sense has been overstepped by looking at disorientation, mystery, and nonsense. It will then be necessary to look at how an inquiry can maintain a relation to the possible interruption of disorientation and what epistemic virtues it is necessary to be open to and responsive to from the experience of disorientation when following through a line of inquiry. Lastly, I will discuss what this perspective on disorientation means for carrying out philosophical studies, how it should inflect our educational practices, and what lessons can be learned in terms of psychopathology and recovery from trauma. In this section, I will extend Mulhall's and Harbin's analysis of disorientation and attempt to elucidate the emotion that is the heart of these experiences and show how this emotion is one which takes mystery as its object. Disorientation can be phenomenologically characterized as a feeling of losing one's coordinates for action. The feelings associated might include unease, anxiety, and a loss of a sense of familiarity. The emotion is typically evoked by circumstances that exhibit something unexpected that is emotionally salient in some way. Trauma can be a common way that disorientation is induced. A couple of examples that we might look at that exemplify the emotion of disorientation are firstly, patients finding out that they have been diagnosed with cancer, or secondly, the experience of those suffering from schizophrenia. In each case, the everyday is stripped of its meaning for a time, and the person experiences an intense feeling of being lost. One patient who received the diagnosis of cancer describes the experience. This is quote 1 on the handout. "When the doctor confirmed my illness, I didn't know what to do. I was totally shocked and my mind went blank. I couldn't believe it and I cried a lot. This highlights that disorientation can be a shock and leaves us without support in the face of the disorientating event. Moving to our second example, Ratcliffe gives the example of the change in the structure of experience that might be found in schizophrenia, and this is quote 2 on the handout. Suppose, for example, that one lost the usual sense of structured anticipation, the background that is more usually taken for granted. All objects of experience might then appear as unexpected, with surprise and bewilderment being the all-encompassing form of one's world, rather than occasional responses to specific occurrences in the world. This suggests that the experience of disorientation could be generalized and become a regular aspect of the world in conditions like schizophrenia. I will return to both of these examples below. Although these experiences of disorientation may be paradigmatic, they seem distant from common experience, and so it may be helpful to relate this characterization of disorientation to more typical experiences that can be found in carrying out an inquiry. One intellectual inquiry that seems pertinent here is examining what our own death means to us. As Mulhall puts it, and this is quote 3 on the handout, if being mortal is a matter of every moment of our lives being internally related to utter nullity or annihilation that amounts to their being internally related to that which is beyond our comprehension. Death is our utter non-existence, so death is not an event in life, not even the last. But the human capacity to comprehend anything is, on Heidegger's account, allowing it to manifest itself to us as it is in itself. So if our death is not something we encounter, it is something we cannot possibly comprehend. So if we embark upon an inquiry and find that we run up against something we cannot possibly comprehend, we are left with disorientation, a sense of losing our coordinates as to how to go on. The example that Mulhall elaborates spells out that some inquiries bring us to the edge of a mystery, and the emotion of disorientation alerts us to this fact. Relating this to earlier examples of trauma and mental illness, we can see that they too involve a relation to mystery. In the case of cancer, the cancer patient, the mystery can be similarly that of one's own death. And the case of schizophrenia can be seen as the encounter with mystery in even the most commonplace experience. To bring this back to cognitive inquiry in general, we can find ourselves at the edge of mystery whenever we come across a question that seems unanswerable. Some questions that seem unanswerable in philosophy include: how does the mind relate to the body? How can we answer the skeptic? How can we justify inductive practices? And so on. Philosophical research seems to occur in the midst of mystery, and to Mulhall, disorientation is the appropriate emotion that acknowledges a discipline that deals with trying to give answers to seemingly unanswerable questions. If any discipline asks questions of increasing generality about their subject matter, they will eventually come across mystery and disorientation. So, to summarize this discussion, we might agree that disorientation is an emotion that registers when we've reached the limit of an inquiry. It is found in experiences when the facts of a situation force us to confront an aspect of the world that seem to exhibit mystery. It is now necessary to look at what role this emotion can play in our ongoing attempts to make sense of the world, and the importance it plays in avoiding illusion and error in our inquiries. We now need to chart the role disorientation can play in cognitive inquiry. If we look at the structure of questioning, the very act of asking a question would seem to have a relation to disorientation. And indeed, some questions can leave us feeling disorientated if we don't immediately know the answer. These questions lead us to a point we have never traversed before, and so we don't know our way about in this particular intellectual space of reasons. We are at a loss, and the emotion itself gives us the experience of having no immediate support for answering the question intelligibly. One way to deal with disorientation of such a question is to backtrack to find where we made the wrong turning into unfamiliar territory. Another way is to relate the question to something we do know. However, both these ways of dealing with disorientation are ways of covering it over. This may seem like a sensible strategy in the face of disorientation and a loss of bearings, but other options are available, and it will be worth exploring these to see what role disorientation can play in our inquiries. The way to acknowledge disorientation is to say, "I don't know," and this confession is an admission that at this point we have come up short at the boundary of mystery. In seeing where our sense-making has run out, we are enabled to start again with an appreciation of where mystery lies. Mystery is intimately related to nonsense. A mystery is something we cannot further articulate, and in trying to say something about it, we invariably produce nonsense propositions. This is not to say that the mysterious is inherently trivial or of little value, but rather we have difficulties expressing anything about it, even though we feel there is an immense amount of value in the direction we cannot quite point at. And this highlights the importance of disorientation. Not having our bearings in a certain intellectual space means that we have to forge new paths so that the mysterious can be registered through what we say about something else or through what we do not say. Mystery can only be shared in an emotional attunement to certain features of the world found in disorientation. We can try to say something about this attunement, which necessarily results in nonsense, or else we can find a new starting point with a newly found awareness of the limits of our inquiry. Nonsense is a constant threat to inquiries, and it can be found in the features of discourse on a topic, such as contradictions, aporias, and fantasy. Each feature can be brought to our attention through disorientation. Wittgenstein's method in philosophy was very sensitive to these features, and he highlighted that nonsense can very often be disguised. If a feeling of disorientation helps us to pinpoint where in our inquiry we have drifted into nonsense, we must be careful how we articulate the insight it gives us. To return to Heidegger's discussion of our own death, the disorientation here alerts us to the threat of nonsense. We can look at Heidegger's way of dealing with this material to see if he successfully avoids unintelligibility. Firstly, he acknowledges that our relation being towards death is a relation to an impossible possibility. That being the case, it is not something we can straightforwardly have a concept of. Heidegger avoids nonsense by suggesting that our relation to this mystery should inflect how we live our lives. That is, he does not try to articulate the mystery directly, but implies that how we relate to our lives can express the existence of a mystery here. In other words, we articulate the mystery through making something else the subject matter of our concern, in accordance with a particular treatment of the subject matter that aims to highlight that there is a mystery in the region. His particular account is that it is necessary to register the mystery of our own death by living a life that is truly individual, a life that is chosen in all its particularity. By enjoining us to lead exemplary lives that register the ways we are different from others, he claims that we will be maintaining a relation to the mystery of death. Whether this successfully avoids nonsense can be seen in whether such an authentic way of living seems possible to others as an intelligible way of negotiating our relation to our own death. This highlights that intelligibility is an intersubjective affair, and when we express ourselves about mystery, it is necessary to see if others can also find sense in our expressions. Logic by itself cannot ensure that we stay this side of intelligibility. Finding mutual recognition of sense is necessary for finding how to go on in our inquiries. It is necessary next to look at the benefits of maintaining an awareness of the feeling of disorientation in our inquiries. One result of recognizing our feelings of disorientation is that if we find that mystery is an ever-present possibility, this will inflect our inquiry with the idea that it is only ever provisional. This in itself can enable us to maintain an openness to other positions and allow us the space to be ever ready to start anew on an inquiry, even given a lot of time and energy spent following one particular branch of reasoning or empirical study. It will also dispel the illusion that we have a bedrock of certainties to rely on, and this agnosticism in relation to inquiring will have the effect of inducing an epistemological humility in us. This virtue is essential to making us responsive to reality. Iris Murdoch claims, and this is quote 4 on the handout, "We are not isolated free choosers, monarchs of all we survey, but benighted creatures sunk in a reality whose nature we are constantly and overwhelmingly tempted to deform by fantasy." If it is the case that we tend to deform reality through fantasy, suggested by our inability to tell nonsense from sense, as Wittgenstein claims, we would do well to try to practice the virtue of humility in our inquiries, and developing a sensitivity to disorientation would help us with this. If inquiry starts when we admit to ourselves that we are lost, this shows that disorientation cannot be separated from our intellectual projects. It may be argued that perhaps disorientation motivates the need for an inquiry at the beginning, but we can leave it behind as we are progressing, and it would just serve to slow us down or disrupt an inquiry that has already started. In response to this, we could say that an awareness of and a regular return to the motivating emotion of disorientation will enable us to renew and concretely assess the progress of an inquiry, as well as helping us ascertain if we have been led into nonsense. Humility, agnosticism, and motivation can all be seen as fruits of developing an awareness of disorientation in our cognitive projects. Another result of disorientation is to allow us to see that we are dependent on others for our sense-making activities. As we do not have all the cognitive resources to carry this out on our own, disorientation shows us that inquiry is constitutively an intersubjective affair, akin to a game where it is necessary that others make moves alongside us to keep the inquiry going. Disorientation highlights where we are trying to make a move that the boundaries of making sense will not allow, and so we need to find a recalibration with the responses of our fellow inquirers in order to go on. In looking for and finding where our co-inquirers are situated in relation to our own position, we learn something about how to remain intelligible to others and ourselves. It also becomes clear through disorientation in relation to the mysteries of our natality and mortality that we inherit sense-making projects from others and pass them on to further others. And this very process of inheriting from the past highlights the fragility of the project. To put it another way, cognitive inquiry is a socially realized practice performed over an abyss of mystery, and our sense of disorientation at points helps us to remember this and keeps us aware of the value and vulnerability of the various interlocking projects that make up our intellectual culture. It makes us aware that we are stewards of knowledge with all the concomitant duties this assigns to us. We are reminded that we are flawed knowers and that our knowing is limited not only our flaws, but also the conditions to our knowledge that are the basis for our ability to inquire and are also the subject of our inquiry. As shown above, disorientation is the basis for a deepening of an understanding of our limits as human beings. This idea of limits corresponds to such facts as our mortality, our vulnerability, our dependence on others, and our failures. Living a life where these facts are salient leads to a sense of humility, which can be developed to allow a cognitive appraisal of the equal value of others and a sense of gratitude of all that is present in life. The value of this emotion the value of this emotion to cognition is that it allows us to pierce through the fantasies that we normally live in, as Murdoch described our situation earlier, by bringing to mind our limits and allow us to apprehend the reality of those limits. By allowing us access to reality, the cognitive benefits of disorientation imply that it is an emotion that can be thought of as central to cognitive inquiries in science and the humanities. It is necessary to remain sensitive to disorientation and incorporate the virtues gained from it in our ongoing investigations. And this has implications for specific domains of inquiry, 3 of which I shall address briefly. Firstly, in carrying out a philosophical project, a sense of mystery is essential to developing and maintaining a position. The acknowledgement that any position is liable to refutation allows the recognition that in philosophy it is a matter of sense-making over an abyss of nonsense. This acknowledgement enables practitioners of philosophy to affirm the tentativeness of their endeavour, but also the importance of the attempt to avoid nonsense. The project of philosophy can be seen as one that is regulated by using feelings of disorientation to signal when we come across disguised piece of nonsense. This is done in order to find ways to highlight the path that leads to this particular piece of nonsense, so as to find ways to communicate intelligibly. Although there are a variety of motives involved in philosophizing, one particular aim must be to express ourselves coherently about very general matters, and this relies on coming up with strategies to avoid nonsense. We looked at one particular strategy of Heidegger's, mentioned earlier in the talk, but the main thrust of philosophy can be understood as the attempt to find strategies to maintain intelligibility, and so the development of a sensitivity to disorientation is paramount. Moving on to education in general, it is always necessary to help students develop a sense of the mysteriousness of the discipline they have set out to study. In philosophical education, this tends to be a commonplace, given that most positions seem open to refutation, and this leads students to doubt that any position can be seriously defended from all criticism. However, this can lead to the feeling that philosophy is a waste of time if the value of this encounter with mystery is not underlined. For other subjects, a certain stress can be put on the fragility of the results achieved in the discipline in a similar way to the philosophy seminar, possibly through looking at more general questions the discipline might lead to, but also through a genealogical approach to the discipline's main theories and central hypotheses. Developing and maintaining the mysteriousness of a discipline for the student is essential to the inheritance of the practices of the discipline, in giving the student the sense that they are a steward in an ongoing project and require humility to carry out this stewardship as outlined above. In order to show the applicability of the development of a sensitivity to disorientation, I will now look at a particular discipline where this awareness is particularly relevant to the subject matter. In the study of psychopathology, an acknowledgement of disorientation can help with developing a fellow feeling and an empathy with people exhibiting mental illness by recognizing that they are not living outside the gamut of human experience, but rather in an existential situation where the inherent mystery of the world presents itself relentlessly. This depiction could be an important contribution to combating the stigma of such conditions, if this were to become an influential understanding of these conditions. To give a characterization of this depiction in terms of illnesses such as schizophrenia and borderline bipolar disorder, they seem to contain within them a continual surprise and bewilderment by the facts of the world, and they can be understood by realizing that disorientation is a possibility when confronted with any seeming fact about the world. Depression and anxiety conditions can be understood as expressing the darker side of mystery, where estrangement from practices leads to a disengagement from the world or a constant sense of threat. Dealing with trauma, as we described in the opening sections of the paper, involving an encounter with disorientation could be understood much better if the benefits of disorientation were taken into account, as is shown by the research on post-traumatic growth. All this suggests that researching the emotion of disorientation in relation to cognition would allow us to understand why it is a necessary emotion for inquiry and what to do when it becomes unmanageable. To sum up, the emotion of bewilderment or disorientation can be seen as motivating cognitive inquiries as a form of collective meaning-making against the backdrop of an abyss of nonsense. It regulates inquiries by allowing us awareness of when nonsense threatens to encroach on particular lines of inquiry, as is found in the phenomenon of contradictions, aporias, and fantasies that detach us from a relation to the real. Disorientation also highlights the communal nature of inquiry as the stewardship of knowledge by exposing us to our vulnerability to nonsense that can be ameliorated by the help of others bridging generations. Finally, disorientation helps us to develop a particular epistemic virtue in having a sense of humility in our inquiries. For these reasons, disorientation should be given further attention as an emotion that is the basis for the possibility of intellectual inquiry and is highly relevant to philosophical, educational, and psychopathological research in particular. Thank you.